Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to campaigns both big and small. And Dunn Street trains engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel really daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience that you can count on. To find out more, just go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And lastly, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, the lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise a community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, just go to their website, which is swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday and dives into the campaigns and the issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And today we're speaking to the member for Watson, and he's also the Minister for Workplace Relations and the Arts. Tony Burke is joining us on the podcast today to talk a lot about his own background and how he got involved in politics, but also his role as the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Obviously a very important portfolio in terms of the economy and Labor's ambitions to do good things for the community, particularly workers, because we all want a wage increase, and the arts as well. So looking forward to today's conversation with Tony Burke. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars and leave a 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify when you're done listening to today's episode, and leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Podchaser. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Thursday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and joining us on today's podcast in situ. This is a rarity, actually. We're being graced with the presence of the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts. Tony Burke, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Good to be here. What's the equivalent of long-time listener, first time? I'm not a caller because I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. You were saying that before. You're off. The people always come up to me and say, "I listen to the show." I say, "I'm really sorry you have to go through that each week. My apologies." But obviously,
that's not a great message to the listeners that we've got right now. We might not carry them.
It's that Australian trying to downplay things when people give you a compliment, because we're not very good with that. But if we're Americans, we would say, "Oh yeah, this is an amazing podcast. You should listen to more of it." But that's not how I behave. Thank you very much for listening to the show, and thank you for coming on the show today to talk about a lot of things. Obviously, you've got a pretty busy portfolio that is near and dear to the hearts of us on the Labor movement, in the Labor movement, I should say. But before we do that, I want to talk a bit about your own background. There is some commonalities that you and I have got, but we'll get to some of those later. But first of all, tell me these Labor values that shape who you are today, where were they first formulated as a young person?
Yeah, look, it's because I came from a family that wasn't political. The first thing that would probably be and we talk about issues, but it was never party political in any way. And I think the first moment probably, I've been very lucky in employment. I've had a job since I was 12. And the first job was as a paperboy. And we had this, I look back at now, with a smile, but back then we were outraged because every other paper shop in the area was paying a 12.5% commission and we were only getting 10. And the employer wouldn't move. And so I said to the other paper boys, and they were all boys, let's form a union and we'll put together our demands. And so I went to the boss and said, we've got our demands, we're a union. He says, no, unions pay fees. You're not a union. Just refuse to even hear them. So went back, everyone threw in a copper coin. We had copper coins back then. These days we don't really have coins at all.
That's true.
But you still had the 1 and 2 cent pieces. Everyone threw in a copper coin. Went back, said, I've got the union fees. These are our demands. And we went through, we wanted 12.5% commission, an extra $1 every time it rained. And we wanted the boss to pay for food for a Christmas party at the end of the year. And he was, well, why should I do that? I said, well, if you don't, we're going to have a PaperBoy Picket line out the front of the shop. And the media will turn up because they'll think it's really funny. We'll be on TV, so we'll feel really important. And everyone's going to know it's your shop and you'll look really bad. And he gave in to all 3 demands. And to celebrate, we spent the union fees on mixed lollies. So that was... but I guess in that sense of organising and seeing an injustice and wanting to act on it and knowing that the collective was the way to get the outcome, that's probably my first entry point.
How did you work that out? Like, how did you know to do those things?
Oh, back then, you've got to remember, early 80s, there were plenty of strikes going on. The concept of picket lines was in the news most nights. Like it started to calm down during the Hawke Keating years. But off the back of those Fraser years, industrial action was the daily nature of what was happening. And also, we were paper boys. Like we were surrounded by the news. We were probably better informed than a whole lot of other people.
And so after this great success, where did your mind start to wander then about what you could do? Like, think about that. How old were you when Paperboy? You were...
From 12 until 18,
right.
So I had it for 6 years.
When did you start to realise that politics is a pathway that you could possibly participate in?
Look, I joined the Labor Party when I was 16, and I'd spent the previous couple of years very concerned about a few environmental issues, particularly the Daintree rainforest. And so I joined the Wilderness Society. I joined a series of different little lobby groups, and they were getting me to write letters to Bob Hawke and to Graham Richardson to get stuff saved. Yeah. And after a while I thought, well, if I'm in this organisation to tell this other organisation to do things, why don't I join the organisation that's actually making the decision and ultimately protecting some of the stuff that I was really passionate about? Yeah. And so that caused me, age 16, to turn up to my first Labor Party meeting down at the Beverly Hills Baby Health Centre. And I was there thinking we were going to talk about environmental protection, about world peace, and there was a passionate, heated argument. Like, everybody looked like they were past retirement age by decades, except for one person who was in like black jeans, a black shirt, mullet haircut, and I was just scared of him. And so they're having this big, passionate, angry conversation. But the issue was not the environmental world peace. The issue was that cracks had developed in the concrete footpaths. Grass was now growing between those cracks, and it was a danger to elderly people in wet weather. So at the end of the meeting, I just took off straight back up King George's Road. Thought, I'm going home, I'm not coming, this is not what I thought. And I hear footsteps running after me. And I look back and it's the guy with the mullet. Oh, God. And he's running faster than I can. And so eventually he catches me and we stay on the side of King George's Road with the traffic going past in Beverly Hills for, it must have been 25 minutes or something like that we were talking. And he convinced me to come back, said he'd come around to my place and sign me up, because back then the membership was done by the branch. You didn't go into the party office to join, you joined locally and they'd then send the paperwork in. And at the end we shook hands and he said, oh, by the way, what's your name? I said, Tony Burke. He asked me I asked him what his name was and he said, Morris Yemmer. And that was my entry to the Labor Party.
I can't imagine Morris Yemmer with a mullet, but there you go.
Oh, I ended up being his campaign director for his first campaign. And it was very early years of Photoshop too, where the party was arguing what were we going to do about the length of his hair.
When I went to my very first branch meeting, I was 16 or 17 in Warrigal, and my dad dropped me off. Same situation, my parents weren't political. Labor Party people, obviously, but not activists in any way, shape or form. And Dad said, son, this is not going to be exciting in any way, shape or form. but don't let that determine, the future. Like, just accept what that is going to be, and there'll be opportunities later on in the future. If my dad hadn't have said that, I would have been like you. I would have been running out that door, because that branch meeting I went to was as boring as batshit. I'm wondering what is the experience for people that now are joining the Labor Party? Like, we're engaging in political movements in such different ways now. We didn't have Facebook and social media and bloody podcasts and all that sort of stuff. How do we welcome people into the party in 2023?
We still haven't got the structure right. And one of the challenges is people with meetings. Back then, the concept of a meeting, and this is sort of really a post-war thing, the concept of the formal meeting was a big moment of social interaction as well. And the procedural parts of what you needed to run it were valued in a way. Now the concept of turning up to something, hearing the minutes, hearing the financial report, and then someone moving to suspend standing orders so that you're allowed to talk about the issue that you actually came there, and that's somehow the odd thing that you have to do procedurally. It doesn't match any of the intentions. So I think where we're at now is there's structural reasons why we keep the branch network and the formality of it the way we do, but we're trying to layer on every additional form of engagement possible that people will find more meaningful. And sometimes that'll be engagement in a direct local issue. Sometimes it'll be little committees and things that we set up quite outside the party, but we encourage party members to attend. But effectively, I think to make it work, it's always a first principles question, which is, what can we do that matches the reason someone wanted to get involved in the first place? And unless we're offering that, we'll forever hemorrhage members.
Yeah, it's funny because I get a sense that there is this debate about, we're not as connected with each other, and I mean society broadly here, not just members of the Labor Party, because of social media, and we're all at home of a Wednesday night watching some show on Netflix, and we're not really interacting with each other that much. Whereas I believe, and people started saying, the practice of organising, and the organising that you and I have always understood, is going to become more and more redundant. And I'm thinking the opposite. I'm thinking people are going to be craving interaction. And one of the takeaways I took from the COVID experience was that people were desperate to hang out with each other, to the point that we'd even catch up on Zoom. I would do, there's, in the first or second lockdown, we got sick by the third or fourth, but certainly those initial ones, we were doing the bloody Zoom calls on a Saturday night and drinking wines and having a bit of a yak or whatever. People were craving interaction, and the party's a great place to bring people together. And to your point, how do we better facilitate and organise? Because we've got great structures. That's one of the strengths of our party, I think. But how do we better facilitate? Because I think we're all in agreement that these, the branch meetings structure is very anachronistic, yet we don't seem to change it. And I don't understand why it's so how hard was it for lean to be created, for example? It took forever for the party to accept, we'll make that an organisation within the party rules. Yeah. Why can't we just let things flourish where people want to meet together and encourage that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think one of the concepts that I always try to come back to remind people of is, people often talk about the Labor Party brand, and we need to get back to the concept we're not a brand, we're a cause. And as long as we think brand, I think we get the answers wrong. If you start with the concept that you're a cause and you want the interaction to be something that validates and advances that cause, then you can get somewhere. So in an electorate like mine, some of the organising stuff we've done there's been big debates around racial discrimination, for example, and people will get very active on that, and the party network becomes a huge part of it. And you're bringing more than the party together, but effectively the party's providing the leadership of that. And this is where we often forget, if you go back to the branches, say, the way you hear about them in the 70s or early 80s, you'd have the head of the PM&C. You'd have the local organiser for various unions. You'd have a whole lot of people you'd have the person who might be running the parish council somewhere. You'd have the people who were the ones who would turn up and be the leaders of community organisations, that the Labor Party branch was something they also wanted to be a part of.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important role for, particularly for elected reps, to try to make sure that we're bringing those people in as well, the people who by their very nature are going to draw more people in, but in the sense that there is a community cause that they are already passionate about. And then you offer the branch network as a way of pursuing that.
Speaking of another institution, you're a fellow traveller of the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church, the same as myself, and raised in, I'm assuming, an Irish Catholic type of...
Yeah, I cringe when you use the term Roman Catholic, because I remember the first time being described as a Roman Catholic and thinking, what? I'm an Irish Catholic. I'm not a Roman Catholic.
I think isn't it like a throwback to sort of like it's a really English sort of Protestant kind of, we're going to define you as the Church of Rome, whereas we're the Church of England? Yeah,
that's right.
You know. I'm with you on that one. But being raised in an Irish Catholic family, how did that shape your values and who you are today? I mean, you were into some Pats, is that right, in Strathfield?
Yeah,
or that was Christian Brothers
yeah.
or something, is that right? Testing my memory.
Yeah, that's right. It's the bigger influence in some ways would have been the parish. So all those sorts of concepts of turning up to meetings and community organisation, that sort of stuff happened through the parish of Beverly Hills where we go each Sunday. And so there was always a relationship there. I think if I go to any message that sort of came to me from all of that experience, they used to, well, anyone who's been to a Catholic church will be familiar with this concept of the bulletin, this single folded sheet, which has sort of got some parish pump information and you know, different bits and pieces on it that you take as a pamphlet when you turn up of a weekend. At the bottom of that, every week, our priest, Father Malone, would have a little thing where he'd say words of wisdom, and there'd be a little phrase. It might be a quote from the Bible, it might be something from a saint. There's one that I only remember one of them, and it's one of the most powerful things I've ever read, which was to avoid criticism, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing. And it's a mantra, I'll tell you what, in this job now, in the middle of different fights, it's a good one to fall back on, because often people will want to say, oh, if you're being criticised for something, that means you're doing something wrong. And people try to find this middle path where you're just constantly avoiding criticism from any direction. And I just reckon that reminder, the way to completely avoid criticism, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing, it's not a path you want to follow.
That path that you did follow, you started working for, so you joined the party, I'm probably skipping over a bunch of years here because obviously you went to university, but then you worked for Graham Richardson.
Yeah.
And there's, as a young bloke when I first joined the party, and I was a human sponge, I just wanted to read as much about the history of the party, and I think Whatever It Takes had come out. And I remember reading that book and finding it absolutely fascinating. And then someone told me about the fix, and I read that as well. And I don't know if there's more myth about Graham or what's steeped in reality and what's the mythology of Graham Richardson. But just what are some of the key takeaways that you had about working with the former senator?
Look, when I worked for Richo, it was when I came in after Paul had won the 93 election. And so Graham had been on the backbench. He'd had to resign over Marshall Islands. 93 election. He's back. Keating's just won the sweetest victory of all, and Graham's made health minister. Wanted communications. Keating wasn't going to let him have communications, but brought him in as health minister. And up until that point, and we forget this because of how the AMA is now, where the AMA now is talking about, wanting a better remuneration for bulk billing, and they'll defend bulk billing. Back then, the AMA was completely opposed to universal Medicare.
I didn't know that.
Completely opposed to bulk billing. And so what had happened was it had got to the point where Labor health ministers had stopped meeting with them, and there was no relationship at all. And Graham always had a view, you got to talk to the people you're opposed to as well. And so there was a big deal soon after I started where Graham was going to be the first health minister in many years to address the conference of the AMA. And in the lead up to it, Brett Gale, good friend of mine, you'd know Brett, was Graham's speechwriter. And so Graham wrote the speech, hands it to Graham. Graham looks at it and says, "No, you need to go harder." So he writes Graham looks at it again. No. Think of what they did during the campaign. Think of how they acted like a branch of the Liberal Party. I want a speech that makes everything clear. Right. So Brett Wright writes this speech, completely tearing the AMA apart. It's distributed to the media with the usual embargoed against delivery. Graham stands up, says, "I've got a speech. It's a really good speech. And the way you've behaved like a branch of the Liberal Party, you deserve to hear it. But at some point, one of us has to say, we're going to stand down and start working together, and that's going to be me. So the speech that I prepared, you won't ever hear it." And then he went on to what he wanted to happen next. He knew this right at the start, when Brett was writing everything. But it was that concept of send the message, don't wreck the relationship, and keep the lines of communication open. And of course, the head of the AMA, who Graham was working with, was a new guy who'd been born in Tasmania, had an earring, and was called Brendan Nelson. And they ended up forging a good relationship. They got a lot of stuff done, a lot of good stuff, in particular in First Nations health. But yeah, that lesson, because you read the different books about Graham, and it's all, here's my enemy, go in, smash them. Yeah. It was quite different. And it was against all the instincts that I thought with the imprimatur of, head kicker, numbers man, all of that. Ultimately, the title of that book, Whatever It Takes. The behaviour was completely different. It was about letting someone know exactly what you thought and then saying, but we've got to work together. How do we fix this?
How did you end up working for the SDA?
It's funny looking back now. It took a long time for the shoppies to be willing to employ me, a really long time. So when I was at uni, the union movement started the Organising Works program. And a lot of people, Bill Shorten, Sally McManus, others, went through the Organising Works program. And I remember being asked about it. For me, both through the paper run and through what back then was called Grace Brothers in Sydney, but is now Myer, the same as it is here, where I'd worked for about 5 years as in children's shoes mainly. And then as a union delegate at a shop called Shoes and Socks when it opened.
Big into shoes by the sounds of it.
You learn a skill, you stick to it. But the union that I'd been part of was the SDA, and so my view was, well, that was a workforce I knew, and I wanted to, if I was going to work for a union, that was where I wanted to work. Yeah. So I didn't do Organising Works. And there'd been this moment, I used to, when I was at Grace Brothers, always have lunch in the lunchroom. Most of the younger casuals would go off to the food court. I'd go to the lunchroom and have lunch with the older part-timers who were there. And one of them had always said, no matter what comes of you, don't you forget the ladies at Grace Brothers. And it's sort of, I've ended up in a situation where I'm able to deliver a bit more than she might have suspected in that lunch break. But the SDA had not recruited anyone who was politically active in the Labor Party for generations in New South Wales. Victoria was different, South Australia very different, Queensland different. But in New South Wales, basically the last time they'd employed someone who was particularly active in Young Labor had been Laurie Brereton, and he'd end up running an internal ticket against the leadership. And so they just stopped. And so there were many years of me sending letters to Joe DeBruyn, the secretary back then, saying, love to work, this is what I'd like to do. And then eventually they would have interviewed me for 2 or 3 years and eventually decided I wasn't going to go away and gave me a job as an organiser. And once I was there, an organiser was what I wanted to do.
Why was that?
I wanted to... A big part of it was I wanted to organise at Roseland Shopping Centre where I'd worked. So there were different moments, because I had a law degree, where there were discussions about whether I'd want to move to a position in the office, which, technically would have been a promotion and all that. Yeah. I loved being on the road. I really loved being on the road. I loved being in the community. And my greatest honour was to be organising in my old workplace. And there were only a couple of people there by then who remembered me from when I was working with them, but there were people who remembered me. And that was very special. And for me, it's that concept as well. I think you're treated differently by the delegates as an organiser when you're a former delegate and you're a former worker at the place where they're working. Yep. There's a different level of understanding that you have.
What skill sets did you learn as an organiser that you still apply to the practice of leadership that you have now in the public sphere? Like, how have you...
The hardest part of it that you learn as an organiser is make sure you report the bad news straight. Yeah, a whole lot of the skills that people can learn, bad skills that people can learn coming through political systems, is always avoid being the messenger of anything bad. Whereas making sure you don't promise anything you can't deliver, and making sure that you're really clear as to what's possible, what might not be, and basically giving the guarantee that the only guarantee I can give you is, in all of this, I will be on your side. And to give that guarantee, that was a hard lesson. And the other one to learn was to never guess. If you don't know the answer to something, where someone had asked about it, right, never guess. Just say, I don't know, I will check, I'll come back to you, because the embarrassment of not knowing was nowhere near the damage of giving someone advice that was wrong.
Do you think it's easier to be a union organiser today than it was when you were organising?
Look, the funny thing with all organising is that we're recapturing what we did probably in the Depression years. And so I think the general pathway for both unions and for the party was to go from an organising model to a broadcasting model. And the pathway in our political lives and industrial lives has been to see the move back to an organising model from broadcasting. And just in time, I've got to say, is in so many ways broadcasting as a concept falls over. But that's basically the pathway. So the organising model for a union like the Shoppies was just beginning when I was there. I remember one of my first conversations with Gerard Dwyer, who was my main point of contact when I started as an organiser, was to take me through the concepts of the organising model, and of helping to build a movement, not by just saying, oh, I can fix that for you, but saying, before I do, can you check if it affects other people in the workplace? Because maybe we can all do something together. Yeah. And I'll have more power to do it if we all get organised, because everyone will back up each other's story in that way. So those sorts of methods, I think there's an arc that basically started at that time of the Organising Works program at the early 90s, where we have just, everything has become increasingly granular. I think the laws for organising at the moment are probably not as good as they were when I was an organiser. Some of that we fixed last year. There'll be this year's laws, we'll see the extent to which we can fix that further. And of course, culturally, we no longer have the presumption from people that they join the union. Whereas when I was organising, we were at the tail end of that presumption, but it was still there in the consciousness.
Because I mean, I don't know if you're still organising when some companies. I was obviously organising the SDA as well in retail, but even when I was in transport, being forced to sit in the lunchroom of a retail store and try and catch the staff as they come in and out of their lunch, but for well the boss has said, don't you go to that lunchroom because the union's there, makes it difficult to build a relationship with workers to then move that that relationship to a point where they say, okay, I see value in that union. I know that I'm jumping ahead of a whole bunch of questions here, but I do want to get to, since we're talking about it anyway, like the 2019 federal campaign from the union movement was, if a theory of change was the rules don't work, we need to change the rules, we need to change the government. Now, I think it's a great theory of change. Unfortunately, it wasn't executed in the sense that we didn't change the government, but we're now in the situation here. Do you perceive the balance between employee and employer at the moment, what you've inherited from the Conservatives, being probably tipped too much in favour of the employer, and how do we bring that back?
I think a lot of what we need to do to bring it back is what we did last year. So last year we fundamentally shifted the dial on the capacity of people being able to organise in order to get enterprise agreements and to have a workable system now where you can do that either directly with one employer or you can do it multiple employers at a time. That shift has seen an we made that shift. We also made the Better Off Overall test workable again, so that if...
Why wasn't it workable previously for our listeners that didn't know why this boot test wasn't workable?
Yeah, so what happened was we got to the point where if there was something in the agreement that meant there was someone on a particular shift where they may in fact go backwards, it wasn't just a problem for that person. The entire agreement would get knocked out. Mm. So you'd gone through years of negotiation, you might have had 98% of the staff vote for it. The impact might affect one person or even a prospective person who did not yet exist. And that would eliminate the whole agreement.
And this is an agreement that could cover thousands of workers.
That's right. That's right. So one of the critical things we changed last year was to say if you get a circumstance like that, then the Commission can fix it, whatever that error is, but the rest of the agreement survives. So they just fix the circumstance for the worker who's aggrieved. And because that was resulting in some organisations that are not unions, some of them go by unions under various names, sometimes run by employers, sometimes run by others, but they basically, those sorts of organisations had an agenda to kill union enterprise agreements, and the system was allowing them to do that, and the previous government had no interest in fixing that. Their only real attempt at fixing that was just say, we'll allow people to be worse off, no matter what. Whereas what we've done is found a way that, people don't get worse off, but if you find that there's an error that's effectively been made, that doesn't kill the whole agreement. It just means you have to vary the agreement.
And we're having those challenges where some companies are just they're letting the agreement expire and they're going back onto the award.
That's right.
McDonald's is an example of that.
Yeah. So now anyone who's had an enterprise agreement that was current any time in the last 5 years, a union can write to them and say, we want to start negotiating again, and they come to the table. That's one of the other changes we made. And then we've also put in the change, because one of the problems was if you were an employer acting in bad faith, you could just drag on the negotiations forever. And as long as you were dragging on the negotiations, you had a pay freeze. Now, if it's the sort of workforce that's willing to go out on strike, which is more likely if people are generally better paid, so they're not living as hand to mouth, and also more likely if they've got more secure jobs, less casualised industries, then you've got industrial pressure that you can sort of force them back to the table. But if you're in a highly casualised industry like retail or hospitality or something like that, or cleaning, those sorts of industries where there's lots of insecure jobs, and industrial action, if it happens, it's pretty hard to organise, it's hard to get a whole group, and the capacity of an employer to use rostering to sort of work around what you're doing is pretty high as well. That meant there was often no way to bring things to a conclusion. Now we've got rules about intractable bargaining. So you got that first rule saying you come to the table, and that's brought a whole lot of negotiations that had fallen over. They're back at the table negotiating. We've then second got the principle of intractable bargaining. So if that negotiation goes too long, you've got a period in the order of 9 months where people can say, look, we need to go to the Commission and get this arbitrated because this can't go on forever, and then the Commission will deal with it. And then finally, if it turns out there's a mistake after everyone's voted and it's all endorsed, you don't kill the agreement, you just fix it. And those three changes fundamentally shift the dial back in terms of being able to organise and being able to get agreements, which ultimately means better job security and better wages for people. The next part of the work that we've got to do, though, is there's a series of loopholes that need to be closed because there are ways of undercutting what are otherwise minimum standards. Now, I'll give you two really key simple examples of where minimum standards get undercut. One, we've got an entire award system. If you're in the gig economy, delivering pizzas on the back of a bicycle for one of the delivery platforms, you're not an employee. You might be with Menulog, but other than that, you're not an employee. And so all those rights that we associate with the award system fall off a cliff. Now, we want to turn that cliff into a ramp and have a system where we say, okay, well, if you're not an employee, it's a bit much if you have no minimum standards at all. So what we'll be doing is giving the commission power for people who are employee-like on digital platforms to be able to say, okay, here's some minimum standards. So that's one of those loopholes where people who you'd think there must be some minimum standard, at the moment there's none. By the end of this year, we should have minimum standards for people in that situation.
That's huge.
And the other loophole is where you've got an enterprise agreement that comes through that's really like a really good one, well above the award. And this is common in some industries. It's less relevant to industries where agreements are quite close to the award, but where you get them well above, employers, not a lot, but some employers have been able to evade what the rates of pay that they've agreed to by just saying, okay, we'll just get the extra staff in now through labour hire. And the labour hire company is technically not the employer, so everything we just agreed to won't apply. And we need to find a way where we deal with where something's legitimately just an outsourced service, like, when a cleaning contractor comes in with all their own equipment and things, that's clearly not a substitute for an employment relationship. But where these people are just embedded within the workforce and things like that, it shouldn't be a way of evading rates of pay that have been agreed to. So they're the sorts of loopholes that we need to deal with this year.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. I mean, that labour hire one seems like a huge one to tackle. I mean, I can think about the airport now, the way that Qantas has set themselves up. That's just like, there's all these companies, they're all labour hire, right? But they're kind of with the company, but they're not with the company. And you just look around all these different jobs. It used to be all just Qantas jobs and good paying jobs,
Yeah, and from a customer's perspective, a lot of listeners won't be aware of this because when you look at people, they're all in the same uniform and you won't expect that they're, in fact, working for different businesses.
Yeah.
And often being paid different rates because of that, which means it can be very common for people to be supervising other people, and the people they're supervising are being paid more than the supervisor because of all the different rates that are running around. Where I don't want us to get to with all of this is sort of the situation that it's been described to me in the United States, where if you go to a hotel, everyone will be wearing the same uniform for the hotel, but you go to reception, who might serve you food, who might clean your room, you go through all the different things, all completely different employers. And part of that is to prevent there effectively from being an agreement where some of the people who are in jobs with a bit more industrial strength are able to help deliver an agreement that works for the entire workforce.
Yeah. We've jumped ahead into the workplace relations stuff, and I'll come back with some other questions in a moment. But I remember when I was, if we go back again to when you were at the SDA, that was a huge segue. I was at, it would have been my first or second National Organisers Conference. I think, pretty certain it was the one that was in Adelaide down at Glenelg at the Stanford.
There are a few at Adelaide, haven't you?
I know my first one, because remember how Joe used to do the roll call, and I was told the night before, under no circumstances, Stephen, can you miss the roll call on the first day, okay? And of course, Stephen, being the rookie 20-year-old, is so excited about it, having a first full-time kind of job, got absolutely wasted drunk, slept in, missed the roll call. And then I think I ran into Joe like at the break or something. Oh, Mr. Donnelly, didn't hear your name called out. When I was like, oh, God, But nonetheless, loved I love the national organisers. But at one of the national organisers conferences, I was sitting next to someone from the Victorian branch, and they pointed you out and said, "See that guy there, Tony Burke?" So they said, "He's going places." I can't remember who it was that dobbed you in that you were going places. Why did you make the shift from the industrial movement to seek public office? I'm interested in that because you were very good at what you did.
Oh, thanks. I always loved both, and I guess in a similar way, I aspired to represent the workplace where I'd worked as a union official, and I aspired to represent the community where I'd lived as a member of parliament. I was always interested in both, but also really conscious of what I wasn't interested in. So for the union movement, for me, with full respect to every other more senior job, for me, organiser was what I wanted to be. And within politics, it was, this is where I live, this is my community. If I can get the chance here, I really want to grab it. And it's funny now, people look back and say, "Oh, you were always going to get there." Just not true. Just not true. There was. I can go through a list straight off the top of my head of 6 different people, all of whom I was told at different points I had zero chance because it would be them. And whenever someone told me that, they were being quite rational. And you wait some people out, you have a bit of luck. Had Bob Carr not promoted Maurice Yemmer to Health Minister, Maurice probably would have left state when Leo McLeod resigned,
right,
and probably would have taken the seat instead of Leo McLeod. That may well have meant that I took Morris's seat in the state lower house. I don't know.
These sliding doors moments.
Yeah. So there's a bit of luck, a bit like there's a lot of local organising, a lot of local commitment. Had I not done all that work, it wouldn't have come together. But that said, there was still a million ways for it to go wrong. And had it gone wrong, I know exactly what I would have been doing, and I would have been loving it.
You've been in this particular job now for come up to 20 years.
Not long enough.
Yeah. It does act, when we were doing the research for this episode and I saw that stat, I went, that can't be right. It only feels like
that was when we first met.
Yeah,
I was very new.
That you were elected. But there you go, 20 years, my God. 2-part question, worst day on the job, and then second part, best day on the job.
Okay. They're actually a bit linked. So I was elected 2004. For people who don't know my part of Sydney, I live in Punchbowl, but the sorts of suburbs that I represent, Canterbury, Campsie, Lakemba, they're suburbs that people will know. Elected 2004, the following year the Cronulla riots happened. Now the Cronulla riots were effectively a riot against my community. That's what it was.
Yep.
And it was really ugly, and there was a real sense of pain in the electorate in 2005, particularly in Lakemba, and a lot of work done from the leadership of the Lakemba Mosque in particular to try to just calm things and not make them worse, not respond to the violence of Cronulla with anything of that sort of order. And so I regretted at the time that I was so new. I was welcomed at the meetings and things like that, and I played a role, but I didn't have the authority yet to really lead the community in the way that they needed someone to. That really hurt. And one of the things that I remember in the months and months that followed, people telling me things like a dear friend of mine by the name of Khaled Sayuni, who runs a local restaurant now, and I used to eat at his tiny little restaurant in Lakemba when I was an organiser for lunch. I remember him telling me about going with his family for a picnic in the city, and just people coming up and abusing him, telling him he was a terrorist. And he just said, "We don't go to the city anymore." I remember women telling me that they had organised a bus trip to the Opera House because none of the women were willing to go into the city on their own because of the abuse that people were copping. And so I felt for my community during all of that, but I also felt pretty frustrated that I wasn't senior enough, been around long enough in a leadership role to be able to really deliver the sense of validation that people needed. So then we get to the best. It came out of another horrible thing. After we'd lost office, first Tony Abbott and then Malcolm Turnbull had campaigns to change the Race Discrimination Act, to change Section 18C, which would have the impact of allowing more racial hate speech. And no matter which way that section would have been drafted, if people were drafting it from scratch now, the concept of changing the law to allow more racial hate speech than already happens was just unthinkable. And it was as the debate started, it was actually at a Labor Party branch meeting of the Belmore branch held in Canterbury Leagues Club. And a branch member by the name of Fernando put his hand up and said, look, this issue that's happening, I know that you've been making speeches in Parliament, but this is really big in our community. Shouldn't we do something locally? And out of that question came a thing that we did twice. And the bigger one was in 2017, that we called the Walk for Respect. And we ended up with more than 3,000 people walking through the streets of Lakemba. We opened with a smoking ceremony at the start of the walk. Then as you walk down, the theme was drums. And there'd be the drum beat first as they woke up the Chinese lions, and then the lions would come with the drumming. You'd go a bit further down on the walk, and then the African drummers would take over. You'd get down to you'd turn left along the railway line, and at the right there's this sort of vacant land, and there were 20 Cook Islanders there with their drums, and then we got just towards the end of the walk, out come the roar of the Lebanese drummers. And then right at the very end when we finished, there's some very polite drumming from the Police Boys Club on little snares. But in organising it, what we did was, or what I did, was made people ambassadors for it. So gave people leadership roles themselves, representing different faiths, different communities. We must have had 40 or 50 ambassadors. And then they organised their own community to come and be part of it. And so there was this whole sense of community ownership. And of course, the second time we did it in 2017, and the unions got involved, people came along. But in 2017, the second time we did it, the day of the march was the day that the Turnbull government gave up on the legislation. And that sense of we can make a difference, we're truly part of the democracy, you could just sense. And there was this lovely email that I got about a week later where a man just wrote an email saying, I wanted to come on the walk, but I was scared because you got a lot of people in my part of Sydney born overseas, and a good number who've come from countries where the state of democracy is either non-existent or not great. And this email, the guy says, I was scared because I didn't know what would happen if I attended a protest in this country. But then I got messages from all my friends halfway through it, and so I got there late, and it was wonderful. Thanks for letting me be part of the decision-making. And I guess something like that goes to what you were asking me right at the start, when you were asking me about how through our branches do we organise. Now, all the branch members were there. The idea came from the branch. The outcome, though, wasn't just for the branches to be entities in themselves. It was for them to be organising hubs of the whole community and to then use that organising capacity to have a community event that to this day, people, my my role in the community changed as a result of that. The way anyone involved, if I put it in this way, if something like that had happened before the Cronulla riots, I would have been in a much stronger position when the Cronulla riots hit to be able to provide what the community needed. And I really felt when we had those walks, even though we were still in opposition, there was a real closing of the circle of Cronulla riots to have gone from the point where the anger of government the community was being punished for, to when a government wanted to do something that we believed was hurtful to our community. We fought back, but in a friendly way, in a happy way, in a way of celebrating who we are, and got the exact outcome we wanted.
I'm really glad I asked that question because that was such a fantastic set of stories there, and there's so much to unpack from that. I mean, Saul Alinsky talks about organising as turning scattered, voiceless discontent into a united protest. How did the community turn that from being scattered and voiceless into, how did they actually organise themselves to build this, cohesive solidarity amongst this diverse community? Like, what was the ways that they sort of built these relationships?
The critical thing was the ambassadors. So we gave people leadership roles, and every community works differently.
Yeah.
So the ambassadors would then tell me, if you come here, you'll be able to, we have organised for you to be able to talk. So I've got a very high level of religious observance of different faiths in my area. So there would be different gatherings, some Christian, some very small Muslim prayer rooms, where I'd do the run of them on a Friday over a couple of weeks, where they'd invite me to talk, and I just say, look, I'm asking you to walk with me. This is what it's about. This is what we want to do. And so appointing people, like in union organising terms, we'd call these ambassadors delegates.
Yep.
That's what we'd call them.
Yep.
Where people you've given people a leadership role, and you've said, help organise your workplaces, is help organise your community. Yep. In terms of the signs, we had some signs printed, and we had sort of messages that we helped people with, but then we had available at the day when people turned up, we had these huge lines of trestle tables with big bits of cardboard and sticks to attach to it, and big texters, and we had all these handwritten signs that people just put together on the day. And some people would put something that reflected their culture. Some people just put a very simple message. But like, people would turn up with signs. There was one that was just, I am, you are, we are Australian. And their perspective was that sign said everything that needed to be said as to why we shouldn't have more racial hate speech. And they had a point.
Yeah. My final question on this one is, how did, because we talk about it in organising, there are action inhibitors that exist amongst people and communities: fear, isolation, apathy, there's a whole bunch of them, right? And what we try to do is tap into these action motivators that get people to move, to shift, to do something. What were the things that you think motivated that community to act together?
It's interesting because one of I'll go to two different concepts. The first concept is people's willingness to participate at all is very much affected by the state of democracy in the country that they come from. So countries that have high political participation, so people of Bangladeshi heritage and Lebanese heritage, very keen and very quick to get involved. People of Chinese heritage, much more reticent about being involved. And then people from areas that were particularly war-torn, or people who had come from refugee communities, very, very reluctant, very, very reluctant. Got some along, but a lot preferred to to be there, but to be waving along the street as we walked past. So there's that. In terms of what's the motivator to participate on this issue at all, personal experience. Like, I'm in the absolute majority in my part of Sydney. I'll go through my entire life without ever being subjected to racial prejudice. Yeah. You know, we'll run the old Irish victim lines because it's been drilled into us. But in reality, compared to what my neighbours go through in Australia, like it doesn't match up in terms of our experience here in Australia at all. So so personal experience. But the really interesting thing, the most common form of bigotry that people would receive was Islamophobia. They were the people marching who received the worst forms of abuse. And 18C, and they knew it, didn't actually protect them because it doesn't protect you against discrimination on the basis of your faith. And it's where, when we had that debate through to about 4 a.m. under Scott Morrison on the religious discrimination, there was an amendment that we moved, and there was it was the longest part of the debate. But because it happened at the time that the journalists were all asleep, almost no one knows that it happened. But about whether or not the most meaningful form of protection that we need is to protect people from religious vilification. Like, that's actually what's really hitting some people. And of course, the so-called free speech people of the Liberal Party all voted against it. Yeah, all of them. But that's the change that we've made commitments about it, and it's at some point as a government that'll come onto the agenda. I look forward to that moment, because effectively some of the people, everyone was marching on the basis that we don't want things to be worse than they are now, but to get the real protection that a lot of that community needs, it takes one step further. And that's a step that the government committed to take. We haven't taken yet, and you can't overly rush these things. But I'll be pretty excited the day we get there.
Jumping back again to workplace relations, obviously real wage growth is a real issue in the community. How does the government address that whilst at the same time not having this issue of inflation? I don't know how to. I'm not an economist, so I'm super excited about how you got an answer for this one.
Well, can I start with the argument that's going to be run out there will be, we can't have wages growth at the moment because we have high inflation. And that argument will be run by the same people who 4 years ago were saying we couldn't have wages growth then because we had low inflation. There will be an argument that is put, and you don't need to unpack very much of it to know there are some people who never want workers to get reasonable wage increases. If you go to what's happened in real wages from the start of the pandemic till now, they've already gone backwards 6%. So, if you had a 6% growth, you'd only at that point be just catching up, regard to where we were before the pandemic, let alone inflation that's happened since. So I don't accept for 1 minute that wage growth at the moment is a significant driver of inflation. There's a whole lot that's causing inflation. A lot of it's international, some of it's supply constraints. Some of it is every extra cost, some businesses choosing not to absorb any of it and to pass it all on to the customer, and then expect that all the absorbing will be happening by the workers. So I don't accept the problem the way a couple of newspapers in particular have wanted to characterise it. And that said, low wage growth was a deliberate design feature of the previous government. And they delivered it in a few ways. They delivered it by never arguing for a pay rise before the Fair Work Commission. They delivered it by every time there was a loophole, a new loophole like the ones I described before, just saying that can stay. And every time there was a court decision that went against the interests of workers, just letting it sit. You put those things together and you get the worst period of flatlining wages in living memory. So we have an absolute objective to get wages moving, and that has now started. If you look at the numbers now, the increase that's just happened to awards on the 1st of July is now just above where the latest figures have inflation tracking. So for award people, we're starting to get where real wages are just starting to edge in front. But we are nowhere near a situation where you could describe anything as a wage price spiral in any way. So I take that argument for what it is, which is there will be a significant number of people who will take whatever the current economic circumstance is and say that's why wages can't move, and that's really all that's going on.
I would be a shithouse workplace relations minister because of my union background, because I think I'd be too biased. Given your background, how are you managing to both maintain strong relationships with the labour movement, your family where you're from, but also at the same time work with employers and employer groups to get outcomes that is going to benefit everyone?
Well, don't forget, with my family and where I'm from, like not a union history. Dad ran a shop. Dad was an employer. And so I come from a small business family, as well as having worked for a union. I ran my own business for a little while as well. So I've lived in different ways in both worlds. And I think you try to approach everything the way you expect the Fair Work Commission to approach everything, with a principle of fairness. Like, that's your starting point. And you then work on the basis that the more you can equalise power relationships, the better outcomes you'll get. And added to that, you also have some things that are just straight policy objectives. So, for example, on closing that labour hire loophole, we made an election commitment about that. So my conversations with business, and I'm just really frank, I say, okay, we are not having a consultation about whether we do this or whether we delay it. We're having a conversation about how we might do this, because there may well be ways that we do this that bring out unintended consequences that I hadn't intended, but you'll be onto them because you'll see how they would affect your business. So you set the parameters of the conversation. And so I always set the parameters of conversation, and I set deadlines. And I learned about the deadlines when we first came to office in 2007, and I, of all things, was Agriculture Minister. And if you know anything about my part of Sydney, if someone's involved in agriculture in my part of Sydney, that's reason for the police to come around. It's not a normal crop. And so I was unexpected in the role, but one of the election commitments I had to deliver was to get rid of the AWB wheat monopoly following the wheat for weapons scandals. Now, I remember different interests coming to me and saying, oh, look, everyone will support you if you just put it off, if you just delay it. And then I had the same thing said to me with the Murray-Darling Basin plan. Look, if you just delay it, we'll get off your back. And I've always had the view that we're here to make decisions, and the one thing, the sort of the architecture that I learnt back then and that I've applied now is what we've committed to do, we are going to do. This is the timeline in which we intend to do it. They're the parameters. So if you want to bash your head against it and argue against that, that's fine. Do it in the media, do it anywhere, but don't miss the opportunity to have an influence on shaping what we do. And it's up to you. And most people, not all, most people will respond to that. And it doesn't mean that they then end up endorsing what you've done, but you do end up with better policy from having the conversation.
And it goes to that point about leadership, about we want to be respected, not liked. How are you going with that? Like, I mean, in terms of trying to build these relationships.
If you look at the business ads, I reckon I'm certainly delivering on the second part of it. And from the private conversations, I think everyone's being respectful to each other.
Yeah.
I mean, the ads that are running at the moment, I find very funny. I've got to say, like, some people have come to me and said, "Oh, you're angry about the ads in the business community." I said, "Well, no, because they're not even advertising against anything we're doing." Like there's an ad that's been running. I haven't seen it for a couple of weeks now, but there's an ad that was running everywhere saying, business is opposed to same job, same pay, where someone who's been there for 6 weeks has to be paid the same as someone who's been there for 6 years. And I looked at it and thought, yeah, I'm opposed to that too. They should keep running that ad. That's fine. Yeah. And they've spent a lot of money on that ad, and I guess it'll be a successful campaign because they've taken something that the government's not going to do, run a big campaign, and at the end the government's not going to do it.
Mazel tov.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Not to diminish your other portfolio, but I do want to ask you a couple of questions. You're obviously the Minister for Arts.
Best job in government.
Yeah, I know, because you do love your arts. You're a bit of a muso. I might throw some questions at the end there about some music tastes that you might have or might not have. What shapes the arts industry in when you came into government after 9 years of the Tories?
Look, it was always going to be weak because ever since George Brandis had been cuts, which had really gutted the small, medium independent sector, the major companies had done okay. Small, medium and independent had really been gutted ever since George Brandis. The other thing that had happened was our major national institutions like the Gallery had been underfunded in a horrific way and just basically being kept on palliative care so they could open their doors. So it was always going to be challenging. But then the pandemic hit, and the pandemic smashed the sector in a really bad way. And look, because I had both the arts and workplace relations, I was the one calling very early on for wage subsidies. So I was glad that they established JobKeeper. But if you wanted to design a wage subsidy to exclude as many arts workers as possible, you'd do it exactly the way they did with JobKeeper. And a tremendous number of people, like we lost a whole lot of people from the sector, some of whom we won't ever get back. Yeah. So the state of the sector was really bad, and that's why the cultural policy we launched at the start of the year was called Revive. The immediate objective is economically to get it running again, to get things up and going again, and in a sort of more almost emotional sense to change the nature of the conversation from being culture war to cultural confidence. And that's the shift that we want to have over these first 5 years.
I'm going to jump now to a question that is related to the arts, but not related to your portfolio. Most formative album that you've ever listened to that shaped the taste of music you have today?
Most formative album. So first album I ever bought was Moving Pictures' Days of Innocence. Second album I ever bought was Circus Animals' Cold Chisel. Most formative was probably 10-1 Midnight Oil.
Why?
The issues. It was political.
How old were you when that came out?
I didn't buy it. I bought it because I looked at the charts, because you used to be able to pick up the bit of paper with the charts.
Yeah, that yellow sheet.
Yeah. And it had singles on one side, albums on the other. Yep. And Midnight Oil 10-1 had been in the charts for more than 102 weeks. And I thought, I should really own this album. So I went and bought it, played it, quite blown away by it, loved the music, loved the anger and the attitude, and then became pretty much a Midnight Oil tragic from that moment on. And so I think that was the moment where the love that I had a serious love of music and the arts, and that was the moment where it started to meld and cross over with my love of politics and issues.
That's interesting. Peter Garrett. And then ended up being
we ended up being elected at the same election.
Yeah, exactly. You're colleagues.
Well, this is where, for me, joining the Labor Party, passionate about the arts and passionate about the environment, thinks, oh, well, I get a portfolio. You get elected the same election as Peter Garrett, and you shrug your shoulders and think, oh, well, won't be those two.
Small world. Now, last question, which is a comparative question. You know, to your point, you were in the last Labor government. How has your experience this time around differed? Like, give us a sort of an inside the beltway kind of vibe check of the caucus. And I ask this question not in a kind of like to shit on the previous government, or I actually generally want to get a sense of you've been in both. So how do they differ? But also what is similar as well that you like?
If we start with the caucus, the caucus now is a caucus that looks like Australia. when I came in 2004, we did not have a caucus that looked like Australia. Of the intake that I was part of, I think we were pretty much exactly 50-50 men, women, but the caucus that we joined was not. Now we've got a caucus with a slight majority of women. When I was elected, no member of the caucus was First Nations. Now we've got, 4 First Nations members in the caucus. And so there's a real shift. And just as a simple example of what does that mean, and the diversity, the ethnic diversity of the caucus now, it looks like modern Australia in a way that it didn't at all when I arrived. A simple example, when I arrived, caucus meetings, you had the Australian flag there, you didn't have the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander flag, and it wasn't controversial. No one had noticed. Like, that's a horror. No one had raised it. And you'd had the media in there, a whole lot of people, like, no one had ever said, shouldn't we have the other flags here too? And that's a real signal as to what changes when you build the diversity of people's backgrounds into that room. People just notice different things and they get raised. And obviously it goes a lot deeper than flags. In terms of the cabinet, if you start with the principle that in any job you get better at it as you do it, then the experience that we have this time is just a complete level of difference to last time. I remember I was lucky enough to be in the cabinet from the start last time, and you'd look around that cabinet and John Faulkner and Simon Crean were the only 2 people who'd been in the room before. Now you go to a cabinet meeting, from the first one since the election, half the room had been cabinet members before. 3 of us, myself, the PM and Penny, had been in cabinet the entire time. And other people like Chris Bowen came in quite early. So there's a lot of people who've had a lot of cabinet experience. And so there are mistakes you make at the start, just not understanding the process. There are mistakes you make in working out how hard can you push the public service, what's appropriate to do there, where you, second time round, you know where those guardrails are and you behave differently and you do the job better as a result. The final sort of overall difference is I've worked under lots of leaders and I've watched leaders from the other side as well. And so this is not a criticism of anyone previously. But Anthony is by far the best chair that I've seen. Second best was probably Bill. But Anthony is an extraordinary chair, certainly the best chair of a cabinet meeting, because you've got to draw that line between keeping your authority but encouraging people to be willing to argue. So if you go to how people tell the stories of the Hawke-Keating cabinet, you hear about the big arguments on telecommunications policy, on industrial, all the big arguments that would go back and forth. You go to the governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and there was always a tendency that we'd just say, okay, if we can't sort it out, we'll try to sort it out outside the room. And we hadn't learnt how to disagree in the same room as each other.
Interesting.
We managed to disagree in different rooms, and a lot of that transpired through the media. But what this cabinet has been able to do is have a really civilised way of fleshing out issues that I didn't see in the 6 years I was there previously.
I'd heard that, that's my last question, I'd heard that under Anthony's leadership as well, that ministers have been given, I don't know if I use the word free rein, but great opportunity to express yourself creatively on terms of the issues that you're wanting to work on. Is that true?
He has been fantastic with that. For me, I didn't experience it that way at all with Kevin the first time. I did with Julia. But when Kevin came back the second time, at which point I'd actually handed him a resignation and he said, no, stay on, and then put me in as immigration minister and the arts. I think I'm the only immigration and the arts minister we've ever had.
Weird mix.
But second time round, I just have no complaints. Kevin gave me the full flexibility to be a cabinet minister and to do the job. And you've got to have the responsibility that you check in. So Anthony has done that probably with the whole cabinet in a way that previous prime ministers haven't. So for both Kevin and Rudd and Julia Gillard, it was probably fair to say there would be some people who they would treat that way, and there would be others where they put much more restrictions on them. Yep. Whereas the PM now's had a view that if you're a cabinet minister, you're up to the job. Yeah. And the expectation is if you've got something that's a margin call that you're concerned about, or something that is big enough that it should go to cabinet, that he gets a line of sight to it.
Excellent. Supplementary question. Did you get tickets to Taylor Swift?
Two of my daughters did.
Lucky
They got them online. But they have to. One of them has to fly to Melbourne.
Oh, because much better concert here than it will be anywhere else in this country.
But they both got them, and there was a point where they said, "Oh, Dad, can you help? We're online. We're not getting anywhere." I said, "Of all the tickets in the universe, one, where probably I cannot help, and two, even if I could, I must not.
Yeah.
It's this one."
So they earned it. Good stuff. Well, I hope they enjoy it.
I do have a couple of her albums, though.
Oh, we all do. We all do. Tony Burke, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been I've really enjoyed today's conversation, and I know that a lot of our audience as well will do the same. We want to wish you and the government the best of luck in the next sort of 6 months, heading into the next national conference as well. Lots of things to talk about there too.
Okay, thanks so much for having me in, and thanks for doing the podcast.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Today's episode of Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians, and they've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means that you'll get the best results possible. To find out more, go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.